Hi, class. It's Dr. Lindner. We are still on the topic of neurology. We've covered some of the basics already. We talked about the neuron. We talked about the neuroglial cells. We spoke about the spinal cord and all the different nerves and plexi, etc. And what we're going to be talking about in the next several videos are going to be a little bit about the brain. Okay. Now, when the sperm and egg come together, right, the very, very first system that develops is the neural system. It's just not called the neural system, right? You're not going to see an actual brain and you're not going to see a spinal cord, but embryologically, what you'll see are things like a neural plate, which becomes a neural fold, which becomes a neural tube. Okay. And these are where most of your neurological tissues are going to originate from. And it begins somewhere around the 18th day, somewhere between the 18th day and third week. From ectoderm, you're going to get a neural plate. Okay. And then it forms into the neural groove and then the neural tube, which eventually will become the spinal cord, the brain and the spinal cord. The ectoderm, when we talk about ectoderm, what's interesting about it is that there are certain parts of the digestive tract that also comes from ectoderm. The mouth and the anus come from ectoderm. So if you've ever heard of like a brain gut connection, where there's a connection between the brain and the digestive tract, maybe this is it, right? That certain parts of the digestive tract form from the same parts that give rise to the neural system, okay? From the neural crest, we're going to get the spinal cord and some cranial nerves. And from the neural tube, we'll get some gray matter and we'll get some white matter and some ependymal cells that are going to line the cavities within the neural system. Cavities like the ventricles, which is where cerebral spinal fluid flows, that CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, in terms of the development of the neural system, originally from the embryological development, you're not going to see the cerebrum right away or the cerebellum or the medulla. These things start as three primary vesicles. And the three primary vesicles are going to be the proencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhomencephalon. Okay, then, and that's at somewhere around the 3 to 4 week period embryologically. Then somewhere around the 5 week time frame, the proencephalon will give rise to what's called the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon stays as the mesencephalon. And then the rhomencephalon gives rise to the metencephalon and myelocephalon. What does the telencephalon give rise to and become? That's going to be the cerebrum. What does the diencephalon give rise to? Pretty much anything with the word thalamus in it. Thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. Mesencephalon gives rise to the midbrain. The metencephalon gives rise to the pons and the cerebellum, and the myelencephalon gives rise to the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. There are some cavities that form, and the cavities pretty much relate to the flow of cerebral spinal fluid. Where does the CSF or cerebral spinal fluid flow? And they're going to flow through four ventricles. Four ventricles. The lateral ventricles are referred to ventricles 1 and 2, one in each hemisphere of the brain. And then there's a third ventricle, and there is a fourth ventricle. The aqueduct is simply a drainage vesicle in which how the CSF flows from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. It's got to go through that chamber. So let's say this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this is the fourth ventricle. Okay. Those are think of the aqueduct of the midbrain as a drainage vesicle that gets the CSF from ventricle 3 into ventricle 4. Okay. Now, when we look at the brain is a very large organ. It's about 3 pounds, and it has a variety of functions. And those functions can range from dealing with sensations, dealing with memories, your emotional state, your ability to make decisions, and even your behavior. These are all controlled by the brain. So if there are any type of imbalances with your emotional state, any type of imbalances to your decisiveness, any imbalances to your behavior, any imbalances to your memories, or even sensations, since the brain controls those things, the brain has to be involved in those dysfunctions as well. And a lot of the times it has to do with how these things are structured. They've done studies on prisoners who have committed really horrific type of crimes like murders and taking other people's lives. And what they've done is they've analyzed their frontal lobes of their brain in here. They've analyzed through different types of functional MRIs their brains, because this part of the brain is involved with their decision making and involved with their ability to determine consequences for actions. And what they have found is that they've had very, very distorted frontal lobes. And since the brain is composed mostly of fat, what they've done is they've given many of these prisoners fish oils. They've given them fish oils or omega-3 fish oils to try and get that type of fat into the brain to help it restructure. And they did find changes in structure, which equated to changes in function and behavior. When we look at the different lobes of the brain, primarily, many of them end up being lobes of the cerebrum, right? If we go back here for a second, you'll see that this largest part of the brain is called cerebrum, not to be confused with cerebellum, right? Cerebellum is this small part back here, but the cerebrum is all of this big part. And the cerebrum has many lobes. The cerebrum has many lobes of the brain. Most of the cerebral lobes have to do with the cranial bones. If you remember back to osteology, there was a frontal bone which protects the frontal lobe. There's a parietal bone that protects the parietal lobe. There's an occipital bone that protects the occipital lobe. There's a temporal bone that protects the temporal lobe. So when we look here, we'll see the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. These are the main parts of the cerebrum. Cerebrum, not to be confused with cerebellum. The cerebellum is back here. Back here, this is posterior. And up here in the front, this is anterior. So in the front is your frontal lobe. In the back of the cerebrum, where the occipital bone is, that's your occipital lobe. Here's your parietal lobe, and here's your temporal lobe. So frontal lobe, this is the one that has to do with your decision making. This has to do with your emotions, your behavior, your judgment, your ability to think rationally and logically. It's involved with movement or initiating movement. That frontal lobe deals with your drive, with your ambition. This is the lobe that also deals with OCDs, obsessive compulsive disorders. This is the part that deals with depression, anxiety, all of this anterior lobe. If we move back a little bit to the parietal lobe, this is the one, oh, also going back to frontal lobe, the frontal lobe also deals with inhibition. What do we mean by inhibition? It means your ability to stop yourself from doing something. So you may, I'll give you an example. Someone may not do well in a class. They may do bad on an exam, and they can go, oh, I failed. I could just kill the professor, right? I could just kill him. Now, the difference between a healthy frontal lobe and an unhealthy frontal lobe is when people say that, most people say it out of frustration and out of anger, and they're not really going to do that. But there are some people that have the inability to disconnect, and when they say that, they obsess on that, and they can't stop until the act is done. Okay, a lot of your road rages come from frontal lobe dysfunction as well. Inhibition is not just inhibiting and stopping you from doing a particular behavior, but inhibition means if you think of a baby when they're born, their heart rate is going very fast and their breathing is very quick. And that's because the frontal lobe hasn't fully developed. It's movement that drives the development of the brain. It's movement that develops the growth and progression of a healthy frontal lobe. Movement is necessary. So a baby hasn't been moving for a very long period of time. So as the frontal lobe starts to develop, that's when the heart rate starts to slow down. That's when the breathing starts to slow down. That's when the baby can inhibit and say, you know, to their mom or dad that, oh, I have to go potty, right? They don't need a diaper anymore. They can inhibit going in a diaper. They can hold it until they get to a bathroom, right? So that's the frontal lobe function when we talk about inhibit. There is a delineation, like right here where I'm drawing this line, is this sulcus right here that's called the central sulcus. And that central sulcus is a delineation between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. In this part, in the parietal lobe, we're dealing with sensation, knowing the difference between right and left, body orientation, sensory discrimination. Is someone touching your left shoulder or right shoulder? Is someone gently poking your left shoulder? Are they just, you know, tapping your shoulder gently, or are they being irritating? That's all parietal lobe stuff. Being able to look at your right limb, whether it's your ankle or your wrist, or your left ankle and left wrist, look at them both and understand that they are symmetrical. But when a person says, look at my right ankle compared to my left, my right ankle is so fat compared to my left, can you see that? And yet someone else looks at it and they look exactly the same. That's a parietal lobe issue. Occipital lobe, right back here, this is where your primary visual center is. So although your eyes may be doing the seeing because they have receptors for sight, they send all that information through the optic nerves, the cranial nerve, the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, all the way back to the occipital lobe. So if there's damage back here to the occipital lobe, you can lose your vision. You can go blind, even though nothing's ever happened to your eyes. The temporal lobe, near the temporal bone over here, has to do with understanding language, has to do with your hearing. Temporal lobe also has to do with hearing and even taste. Taste and hearing are controlled by those temporal lobes. Just inferior to the occipital lobe is the cerebellum. Now, again, don't confuse it with cerebrum. When we look at the word cerebrum, that's not the same thing as cerebellum. Cerebrum is made up of all these lobes: parietal lobe, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. Cerebellum refers to only this, the cerebellum, which controls your balance, your coordination, and fine muscle control. This is when a police officer may see someone driving in a car and maybe they're swerving in and out of lanes. They may think they are driving under the influence, a DUI. I think they used to call it a driving while intoxicated. Now I think they use the word driving under the influence, a DUI. And if someone's driving under the influence, that could mean drugs or alcohol, any type of chemical, even certain medications. If you're driving under certain medications warn you, do not operate heavy machinery, which is exactly what a car is. You could do some damage because many medications and drugs impair your judgment. They impair your ability to coordinate turning a wheel, turning your head, stepping on an accelerator, stepping on a brake, right? You think of how many accidents happen from the parked position. People are parked in their car, and instead of hitting reverse, they hit drive and go through a store. And then when they do further investigation, they find out they were on medications. And of course, it impaired their judgment. It impaired their ability to coordinate. So if you're driving under the influence and a police officer asks you to step out to touch your finger to your nose, well, what are they assessing there? They're looking to see if chemicals, drugs, alcohol got into your cerebellum that will impair your ability to coordinate that and control your fine muscles. Or if they ask you to walk heel to toe, they're checking your balance. That's what the cerebellum does. Okay. The brainstem is this lower part here that's made up of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. 3 different parts of the brain make up the brainstem. And this controls your breathing, your blood pressure, your heartbeat, digestion, swallowing, body temperature, your alertness, your consciousness. That's what the brainstem does. Okay. So when we look at the brain from a side view, and I like this picture because it does show different colors that will differentiate different parts of the cerebrum. You can see the frontal lobe in pink. You know this is anterior in the front. And then back here, this is posterior. So that's why we have the occipital lobe back here. Here's your parietal lobe, and here's your temporal lobe. Those are the main parts of the cerebrum. Now there's this delineation called the central sulcus. That's right here. That's this groove, that depression, which is the delineation between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. You can see that this is like a little pink, but this is a darker pinkish, and this looks like a little lavender, and this is a darker purple. So this darker purple area is still part of the parietal lobe, but they call it the post-central gyrus, and the darker pink is the pre-central gyrus. Pre means before, post means after. Pre-central gyrus comes before the central sulcus, and the post-central gyrus comes after the central sulcus. This pre-central gyrus is considered to be your primary motor area, meaning this is what's going to initiate movement. And then your post-central gyrus is your primary sensory region. So you have a primary motor area and a primary sensory area, two very, very important areas. Your cerebellum is back here for balance and coordination. And then here's part of the brainstem. We could see the medulla, and above that we see the pons, but we can't see the area that's just above, which would be the midbrain. Right? You have to cut away some of that temporal lobe in order to see the midbrain. But that would be a lateral view of all the different parts of the brain. Now, this is without the coloration, same exact parts of the cerebrum. Once you see the cerebellum, which is a unique shape unto itself, that tells you this is posterior. When you find the cerebellum, that's posterior, so then you can label this anterior, and that helps you now separate your frontal lobe, and the back you got your occipital lobe. On the side where your ear is, that would be your temporal lobe. Now here's your central sulcus. If you follow this groove or this depression, it goes all the way down right here to the beginning of your temporal lobe. That's how you can find the central sulcus. It's this depression that goes all the way through from the center down to the temporal lobe. So that what comes before it is your precentral gyrus, and what comes right behind it is the postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus is part of your frontal lobe. The precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe, and the postcentral gyrus is part of your parietal lobe. Down at the bottom, we can see the medulla, the pons, but we cannot see the midbrain from this cut. Now, one of the things that I want to point out to you is that this is your primary motor area, right? That precentral gyrus. And the postcentral gyrus is your primary sensory area, meaning every single part of your body is represented by the precentral gyrus on the motor part, and every single part of the body is also represented at the postcentral gyrus for the sensory receiving end of it. And in your books, you're going to find something that is called the homunculus. The homunculus is this very, very odd looking model of the human body that reflects how much of the brain tissue is dedicated to each part. This means that the parts with more sensory and more motor nerves are going to be enlarged, like the eyes and the lips and the tongue and the fingertips, right? And the areas that have less neurological innervation appear to be a little bit smaller. So it results in this distorted body scale that's pretty bizarre looking, I would admit. And those areas, if we look at the bottom, you can see that sensory, somatosensory cortex here in blue, this strip, and then the motor cortex is red, is this strip, right? So the whole thing, whether it's the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere of the brain, they both have a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus. Precentral is motor, the blue is postcentral, is sensory. So if we take this strip in red, you can see the the homunculus, which is the very odd looking, distorted view of the body where you can see a big part of the brain is controlling the face, the eyes, the lips, the mouth, the tongue, the fingers, the hand, and the larger body parts like your thighs and your legs and your feet, although they are huge, massive muscles that are associated with those parts, they're not controlled by many, many brain cells. The more precise and precision that's involved in the movement, the more brain cells it's going to utilize. So your eye muscles are very small, your tongue muscle is small, your lip muscles are small, but yet all your facial muscles are small compared to the quadriceps and your calf muscles, but your face and your fingers are going to occupy more space in both the motor cortex and even on the sensory side. Your lips are very sensitive. Your fingers, with your eyes closed, you can hold something in your hand and almost predict what type of object is in your hand because it's controlled by so many neurons in the brain. So although the quadriceps and the legs and the feet, they may be big, massive body parts, they're not represented by a lot of brain space. But the fine, coordinated movement, the parts that require that, which are typically represented by small muscles, do occupy a lot. So that homunculus is an important concept. Again, to review the main parts of the cerebrum, right? The main parts of the brain, the cerebrum, which is there. In the center of the brain is an area called the diencephalon, which is made up of anything that has the word thalamus in it, thalamus and hypothalamus. On the back, you got the cerebellum. Again, don't confuse these two. They're not interchangeable. Usually with the cerebrum, you'll hear people say the cortex, or they'll say the cerebral cortex. When you hear cortex or cerebral cortex, that's referring to the cerebrum. When we talk about the cerebellum, they may refer to it as the cerebellar cortex. Cerebellar. Okay. And then we have our brain stem, which has three parts: the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. From inferior to superior, it's made up of these three parts: medulla, pons, and midbrain. Okay, I think we covered that. The only other thing that I wanted to show here in this picture, everything's labeled a little bit different. This view, you can see again, cerebrum, diencephalon has everything with the word thalamus, thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. The only part that we're introducing here for the first time that's part of the diencephalon is something called the pineal gland. Not to be confused with this one in the front called the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is in the front, and in the back we have the pineal gland. They both produce different hormones. Pituitary produces lots of hormones. Lots of different hormones are produced by the pituitary gland. We'll go over that in more detail in anatomy and physiology too when we cover the endocrine system. But the pituitary is part of the neural system and the endocrine system. The pineal gland produces some hormones, primarily melatonin, and the pineal is also part of the endocrine system and the neural system. Notice the cerebellum is back here. Kind of looks like a leaf, right? The cross section of it looks like a leaf from a tree. And then you have your medulla, your pons, and your midbrain. That's the brain stem. Okay, good place to take a break.